going to discuss GlebeConnected, who are a group of passionate individuals and organisations who share the goal of a socially sustainable Glebe. David has spent nearly 20 years working on place-based initiatives that seek to improve the health and well-being of individuals and communities. This has included initiatives branded as community development, service coordination, social planning, place management and collective impact. David is currently Senior Advisor Community Impact at United Way Australia, an Associate at Collaboration for Impact and Principal Consultant at Holos Consulting. Mitra Gusheh is from the University of Technology, and we have to give a big thank you to Mitra for organising us this amazing room today. Mitra is the Manager of Social Impact at the University of Technology. In her current role, she led the process for developing the UTS Social Impact Framework and is establishing the Social Impact Lab, a space through which the university responds to community-driven challenges.
So today, Mitra and I will do a little bit of a double act talking to you about GlebeConnected. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that sort of sit behind it and then give you a bit of an introduction as to how things got moving, and then Mitra will jump into some of the detail of trying to wrestle with some difficult but important local issues. So this probably sounds a little bit like what you've heard from Jack's, but just to put, I guess, our particular sort of local spin on it from the Glebe perspective. So co-design, what we usually mean is participatory or collaborative design of products, services, policies, projects. I think everyone sort of knows broadly what that looks and feels like. The questions that I think are constantly in our minds are who participates, on what terms, and for how long. And when you're thinking about community, that's a really important set of questions. What's different about co-designing with community? I've got a couple of different examples here. If you're within an organisation, then typically you've got someone in a leadership sort of role who oversees essentially all the staff involved in a project. If you're working across multiple organisations, you tend to have people who are at the table because they're in a similar position or they've got some sort of common interest. If you're involving community members, you're starting to mix things up because community members have all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of perspectives. And when you start to collaborate, with all of those players, the sort of complexity goes off the charts. I quite like this. I think one of the things that I've been guilty of in the past is trying to sort of use co-design principles and activities for specific elements of a project. It's like, okay, we've got this problem, let's co-design a solution. What we wanted to do in Glebe is really to support a community initiative all the way through. So I quite like this chart that I stole from Twyford Consulting, which goes from committing to collaboration to co-defining a dilemma, although you could put a more positive spin on that, a co-design process, co-creation of a solution, co-delivery of actions, and perhaps also co-delivery of monitoring and evaluation as well. I think it's important that we're thinking about the whole process when we work with community. This won't be a surprise to anyone, but very much that you can't know what will work with community before you start. You can't write the 3-year plan and implement it. You try, things don't work, you adjust, go down a slightly different route. So fairly simple, but again, really hard, I think, for us to work with some people on. There are people who are used to setting up the 5-year plan and they want to stick to it. So it takes a bit of time with all of the stakeholders to get them into this sort of space where they can accept this way of working. From my observation, community are actually most accepting of this. It's all the people who are trying to work with them, who have butts to cover and KPIs to report on, that this can be a struggle for. It's a bit of a cliche, but things move at the speed of trust, and that's certainly true in community. Bricolage, I came across this concept, a few years ago, some of you probably heard of it. It's that idea that you combine the things that you need. Again, I think it's easy to go into a place-based co-design sort of situation and feel like you've got the co-design tools in your back pocket, you just need an audience to start playing with you. And the idea of bricolage is really you don't know what you need until you get in the room, and when you figure out you need it, you pull it together. And so, that can be with more or less time on your side. But certainly, and we'll get onto this in a minute, the work that we've done in Glebe, it hasn't gone how anyone thought. We've made up some new tools, we've drawn on different tools that we didn't know that we'd need. The ups and downs of funding. The project in Glebe is really different to the one that Jax was talking about in the sense that it started without any money. It started as an idea amongst community members, and then a group of people went looking for some funding as things started to progress. But it's still a constant challenge. I like to think that the initiative in Glebe is really authentic because of that starting point. But, we've been working together for a while now and we have ambitions, and you'd like to be able to do it by just reorganising things, but ultimately you want some money. I won't dwell on this, but just to remind people, you've probably seen it before, of the IAP2 spectrum that sort of goes from informing community to consulting them, involving them, collaborating, and then ultimately empowering them. And we were very much in Glebe going for the empowering end of the spectrum. And really, it started at that end because it started in community. What we needed to do was try to stop it from falling back. We didn't want to go in as professionals and take over and reduce the power and influence of community. I think this explains some of the challenges that we've struck pretty well. So talking about conditions of systems change. You heard a little bit about systems from Jax. At the top, the things people normally look at when they want to create change: policies, practices, and resource flows. So obviously they're all important. But below that, the thing that some people get to, the semi-explicit relationships and dynamics of power. That's, in my experience, as far as most projects go, even projects that are deeply embedded in community. I think the challenge is to get to the mental models. If we really want to create change on a place basis, you need to be thinking about people's assumptions, their business as usual, their default mechanisms, and starting to change those.
I don't live in Glebe, but I sort of consider myself a quasi or de facto community member in Glebe. It's the painting that I've got all the time of shots in Glebe. For those who don't know it, it's a really diverse community. It's a bit artsy, it's near a university, it's got public housing in it, it's got water views, so it's got a real genuine mix. A bit about the population, talking about 16,000 people, it's got an increasing mix between the census periods. Aboriginal population being constant, a bit over 300. Probably doesn't sound like a lot, but as an urban Aboriginal population, it's quite a substantial number of people that have in a relatively small area. Inequality, you see here, it's almost exacting. It's a quarter of people at least $650 a week, a quarter of people are running over 3,000. So it's a really diverse group. Employment, contrast there between the Aboriginal community and the rest of the Glebe. Full-time employment about 62% across the board, 46% of the Aboriginal population. So the other differences there, much higher unemployment rates amongst the Aboriginal community. Housing, quite labourist, really key figure for us is the 13% people in social housing. That tends to be where that covers disadvantage, certainly not exclusively. Happening disadvantage in Glebe, so they're probably not quite the right language, but there are people in Glebe who talk about the rich end of the poor end. So up the north, we've got the relative advantage, you've got water views, you've got people who own their own home, and they tend to be quite high incomes. Down the bottom, particularly in the southeast corner, that's where you've got the public housing estate. Concentration of low levels of employment, lower income, etc. History of GlebeConnected first started in 2015 with a bunch of people getting together. These were all sort of groups that already existed in Glebe. City of Sydney, Coalition of Glebe Groups, Forest Lodge, Glebe Nation Group, Glebe Society, University of Sydney. That was sort of the official group that got together, but really the initial conversations came from a couple of people who actually lived in the region, Glebe, and wanted to maintain the diversity in their community. So they sort of saw there were rumours floating around, there often are in Sydney about public housing sales. And the wealthy didn't mentally actually said, no, we don't want public housing sold off here. We moved here because we like the benefit, we like being in a diverse community. So let's start to think about how we support things in public housing rather than trying to push them out. So a number of things happened during 2016, relatively informal meetings, workshops. 2017 was a small amount of funding for the City of Sydney applied to produce a couple of documents. Went through the more formal analysis of what was going on in Glebe, in terms of data collection, mapping of organisations and systems in Glebe. Last year, which was actually the first year that I was formally involved, what we tried to do was put some structure around all the conversations that have been happening. So it's probably 2 weeks that read up the back, I'll just talk through it a little bit. A bit of a theory of change, I guess, or a particular theory into the theory of change. What we sort of said if we put this together was there's a leadership group that sets direction and oversees the work, and there's an emphasis on having community as a strong part of that group. And then, as the year went on last year, we realised that the group started growing and people didn't want to have the representation of the group, they wanted it to be open membership. So what we needed to do was put in some subgroups to actually get some particular things that have worked done. So
if we've got a leadership group and they're doing their work, we'll be drawing on 3 key approaches, again quite similar to Jack's and her presentation. So we want to combine collective impact, and some of you have probably heard of that, with strengths-based community work and some co-design principles.
From around 2018 onwards, and we are learning as we're going and trying to actually find our way forward. But it really responds to some of the things that David mentioned and Jack's mentioned, in the sense that you actually arrive in community and you are working collaboratively with people, and you've got this vision or a set of assumptions of how things are going to unfold. But of course, the realities of the situation come into play in different ways. And what you want to do is make sure, or what was the intent of our group, was that none of the threads got actually lost. So the notion of, like learning through action and being reflective while you're practicing is well and truly alive in this project. And we're responsive and we adapt continuously. So, David's saying it doesn't look anything like what we thought. We thought we would go into community, we'd all identify a shared vision, a thing, and we would all work on it. And it actually hasn't been like that. And I think that that's what makes it so exciting. So the 2 pieces of work that I want to talk to you about, looking at that picture of maybe going back where we are at now, 2 of those sort of circles that are emerging as focus areas, the cradle to career and the aging, to sort of like demonstrate how things are actually getting unpacked in different ways. So the first of those is around the cradle to career, and how that piece actually came together was through people and the kind of people that were sitting around the table, and through the process of dialogue and exchange and trying to actually work through the complexities of the kind of things that are impacting communities, the people at the table started identifying those 4 focus areas, and very quickly there was a mass gravitational pull towards the cradle to career. And fundamentally, because a lot of the organisations that were sitting around the table at the time, and a lot of the community representatives that were sitting around at the time, that was their area of focus, and there was a piece of connection with that. And following that notion of the asset-based approach to practice, we really wanted to actually harness that strength and allow it to actually just blossom and grow and flourish. So that's where we began in one of the areas. So the groups came together. We had community members, government representation, educational, at multiple levels, educational institutions in terms of the primary school, the high schools, the service providers, funders sitting around the table, and began the conversation. And what was really interesting, it was the network of people that were actually coming together around that space. Probably hard to see at the back, is that although the focus was around these young people and their families and the communities that surround them, the majority of the people who were representing, were sitting actively around the table, were the first tier of direct contact, place-based organisations that were really in touch with the communities and brought in the representation of the voices and the thoughts. And obviously from time to time, then we started going out through the concentric circles to actually involve the system players. And we began pulling in insights, information, those sense of assets and the strengths of the of the communities who were involved in different ways. Lots of different kinds of conversations. We had a forum where we did invite all the system players, and there was about 40 odd organizations who came around the table, and we began mapping what the assets were and what the concepts were, what the enablers were, what the barriers were. We held one-on-one conversations with the majority of the players and got their perspectives around what young people were thinking, feeling, what their families were thinking, feeling, what the services were thinking and feeling, and started mapping those and built, started building a dialogue. And it was interesting to actually begin with those first tier of service providers, because even then it's very apparent that their voices alone aren't enough. And at key moments, there's actually going to be pieces of information that's missing. It's interesting. We're at the Human Rights Commission this morning, and they were talking about AI and data, totally unrelated. But they were talking about big data, and they were saying how you can't actually make big data be what it isn't. If it's missing information, you can't actually construct it without it being there. And it's the same here. Like if you're actually missing information, you need to be able to actually include those voices at some point. So, we went out and actually interviewed the elders. We went out and interviewed, worked through the school to actually connect in with the young people and begin collecting their narratives to make sure that we're actually pulling in all of those different threads and working across the system to make sure that the voices are being held. And so essentially the conversations were floating back and forth with no structure other than almost like using a process of being somewhere, being reflective of what information you're missing and reaching out to the zone that has it to be able to actually fill in the gaps. And so we had big forums with lots of people and the systems. We had pockets of people in terms of the school, the youth services, etc. We had more focused areas around having a lunch gathering for the elders. And actually that was quite important as well, because we were really recognizing that the voices were missing and recognizing that perhaps the table that we normally sat at was not, inviting enough for everybody. Who wants to sit around a table that looks like that? Not many people. So, we had lunch. We had. So it's almost like being considerate of not only who you need to talk to, but how you need to have that conversation. So we did all of that and began to draw together the common threads. And, what was nice about it was the diversity of the approaches that existed, and the rich knowledge of where change was needed. And so all of those information, then we actually pulled back and started categorizing to be able to deliver a theory of change. So for us in the industry, people talk about theory of change in lots of different ways. So some people talk about a logic model as a theory of change. What we refer to a theory of change is a backward mapping one, and it talks through, it's a framework around how and why, and articulates your grand vision around a place. And rather than actually forward mapping from activity onwards, I'm doing this because, and then articulating why you think you're doing what you're doing, actually begins with the notion of identifying the outcome that you want to see and mapping back the preconditions. So beginning with the vision and then considering all the things you need, not necessarily the things you're doing, but all the things you need to be in place at the same time for that change to actually come about. And so that's what we did. We began and we started mapping the theory of change for Glebe in terms of what people's visions were around the cradle to career. And at this point in time, it's a vision around educational outcomes of young people. That's important because of the kind of impact that they want to have in the world. And then it begins with actually starting to map out, well, these are the preconditions that need to be in place. And fundamentally, it needs to be it's supported through an inclusive and culturally appropriate and well-recognized sort of community that's in place. And the benefit of having this map is this, in the sense that it provides us with almost like a vision of where we want to go, not necessarily the reality that we have. But it allows all the different players to actually find their place in it. So some of the learnings that I've had is that very early on in the conversation, you could see the pattern of conversation emerging in the sense that we were very quickly understood that a big part of the focus of the project needed to be around pockets of extreme disadvantage in Glebe. And a lot of people actually agree with this. But we had 40 people around the table, some of which don't actually connect to, to that vision in the sense that they don't know how what they do connects to this, right? With the theory of change, what it has allowed us to do is to say, look, educational outcomes we need to arrive at this in multiple layers. So what we need to do is actually think about, where is it that all the different kinds of activity, including co-design, fits in that picture? It's not relevant to every aspect of it. So let's begin with thinking about, okay, we've got a shared vision that we've all articulated together. If we're actually going to agree on this, and this is actually the moment that we're at the moment, if we all agree to this, let's all think about all the amazing things that we do, all the assets in this community, and start moving towards this shared set of outcomes. So then that way, we can actually know that we are all contributing to some kind of a shared goal and that we're moving towards some kind of a trajectory. We can then support the community to be able to actually articulate how and when they're actually doing that. And you get the points of connection between what people are doing within their own space and an articulated vision of collective impact. But also, we can actually identify, like Jax was saying, in the theory of change, there are zones that will offer us points where we can actually put interventions in place where co-design, new ways of working might allow us to actually, reap results. So we can put the boundaries around that and say, you know what, at this point in time, we have not much resources. So as a community, let's use our knowledge to pinpoint back on the theory of change. Where is it that we can actually put some kind of a pressure point where together we can actually bring about change in a different way? And let's start producing some processes in place to devise co-design solutions together as alternative approaches to get better outcomes for communities. But still, that focus of ours where we've identified that actually a big part of the problem here is the most complex part of the community. The ones that, when we were talking to some of the organizations, the way they described it is, they said, look, Mitra, in Glebe, 80% of the population are absolutely fine, and it's true. 80% of the population are doing fantastic. The next 15% have complex kind of issues. The last 5%, I can't go there, And the notion of actually then coming together in a sort of like a collective impact actually responds to that, because none of us alone can actually respond to that level of complexity, but possibly together we can come up with a new way. And here at the third level, we can actually make an investment in terms of how we might do that. So that was the cradle to career. The second approach worked out quite differently. The second approach, the notion of aging, was actually voiced by some members of the community who are experiencing aging, are living in the community, and they said this is an important matter. And there was no, galvanization around that topic. There was no organizations that obviously works around that space or anything like that. But you hear something from a community member, you can't let it go. So you go, okay, no, we have to do this, but maybe collective impact is not the right kind of framing for this. Maybe we need a different kind of approach. So for aging, we began with this notion of what does aging even mean? Where does aging start? Because I'll tell you, I'm actually feeling quite aging myself, 9-year-old, 7-year-old, aging. I have white hair, And so we began with Appreciative Inquiry. Appreciative Inquiry looks at, is an asset-based approach to practice And it moves from the, a deficit model where we actually go, look, here's a problem. We're going to look at the problem. We analyze the problem. We focus on what the solutions might be. And the argument there is that the organization, it's an organizational change theory, moves towards that negative space. And appreciative inquiry flips that and says, let's begin with our strengths. Identify the best of what already exists and define then what's possible and then move forward. And that's how it actually then progresses it. And that's what we did. So we've begun this, and again, we're at early stages of this where we've got a little interview template that we've developed. And the beautiful thing with Appreciative Inquiry is that anyone can do it. So what we're doing is working with community members and hoping that they will take on the act of interviewing other community members. We're hoping to interview 100 community members around, I want you to think about what it feels like and what it is like to actually be an aging person in Glebe at the moment. Tell me, what are the best things about it? You think about that golden moment of thinking, oh my God, I actually love this moment of my life. And I want you to tell me all about that moment and tell me about what makes that moment real. What are the enablers? What are the barriers? What are the, how did you overcome the barriers? What were the things that helped you overcome the barriers? What were the systems? Who were the people? Tell me about the bus. Tell me about and unpacking that to then create a picture of what it means to people to be aging. And again, we're at very early stages, but, people are telling us very different kind of stories that we're getting from the other process methodology. And what's really lovely is, what they actually talk about in terms of the process and their connection to each other after having shared stories. And they the stories that they've shared with us are just, it's incredibly touching and generous of a generous act by them. So this is where we are, and we're hoping that again we will develop some kind of a sort of like a map of the system around where we're heading with the aging, but offering two different approaches and a reflection of how it's important to actually be just responsive to where people are at, where the community is at, and just using the strengths that you come across. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.